My name is Martin Madert with the Witness to War Foundation. It's September 17th, 2023, and we're in Colorado Springs, Colorado, sitting with Mr. Bob Peavey, P-A-V-E-Y, Doug Chamberlain, C-H-A-M-B-E-R-L-A-I-N, and Mr. Don Scott, S-C-O-T-T, who served in the Vietnam War with 5th and 1st Tanks for You, Bravo Company. How are you doing today, gentlemen?
We're great.
Good.
I'm
Thank
good.
you.
I'm
All
doing
right.
fine.
I appreciate y'all taking the time to join me. Tell me about the 5th Tanks, Bravo Company. When did y'all join?
You want me to go start?
Yeah, start with Don.
Okay. 5th Tanks was stationed. I was with Bravo Company, 5th Tanks, platoon leader, lieutenant for 1st Platoon, and Lieutenant Gilliam had 2nd Platoon. We reacted to the Tet Offensive. 127 was deployed, and at that time, it was decided that the tanks would be physically loaded aboard ship and be shipped to Da Nang. Most tanks that fought in Vietnam were already there, but we took our tanks. And so that's what we did. And
that was very unusual that late in the war, too, that here's new tanks being deployed and coming into country. That was like 1960. That last time that happened was 65, and we're talking 68 now.
Are you talking about brand new tanks? Never been used before?
Oh, they've been trained within the States and all, but they hadn't been through what normal Vietnam tank ends up looking like.
So when did you join the company?
I was at a tank school in 1967, and at that point, they start splitting you up as to what tank units you're going to go to. And of course, the most open billet in 1967 was Vietnam. Luck would have it, I went to the newly forming 5th Tank Battalion in Camp Pendleton, and so did John Ware. A lot of guys ended up going that route. And when this whole thing came up about a year later, Tet started. And that's what drove all the craziness of, we got to get troops to fill this. We need people to fill these slots in the infantry units. It was crazy. They started yanking people out of tanks and throwing them into infantry units, cooks, military police. It was just whatever. You're a rifleman, it's your first job in the Marine Corps, and that operation really showed. And so it was just a crazy time in the base when it was first 127 had flown over, 227 was in the process of flying over to Vietnam, and we couldn't fly with tanks, obviously. So when 327 left, we were right out at sea by that time. And it was a pretty fast mount out. And it was, if anybody ever reads the story about, there's a book called After Tet. There's a section developed to this operation we're going to talk about, Allenbrook. And the success that we had, and the infantry also had, the 27th Marines also had tankers in it who were now infantrymen. And they ended up helping at one point where a tank needed crewmen. And in the middle of the field, somebody's going like, I know how to drive a tank. And they grabbed him to fill the tank crew. So it was a very amazing mount out of a combat unit of people with huge, vast backgrounds, never trained together ever. And this operation was their first test of fire.
And Doug, who were you serving with?
I was with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. I was a company commander of Echo Company. I got to Vietnam in July of 1967, and I hadn't had any combat experience, but ended out through kind of some strange circumstances as a company commander, as a 1st lieutenant, which was normally a captain's billet. And we operated in the Haibon Pass area, north over towards Fubai, and then west of Da Nang in a rocket belt. And that's where we were when the Tet Offensive hit. And we actually ended up behind the enemy lines because they were attacking the airfield at Da Nang, and we were behind them. And so we it was a matter of survival for us there for a week or so. But then the military commanders, in their experience and knowledge, decided after the Tet Offensive was over not to pursue the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, and that they withdrew southwest of Da Nang into what was later called, or maybe always called, Happy Valley. So then the emphasis began to try to 3 or 4 months later to attack them in an area called Goonoi Island and the area around Anhua, and that was an area straight west of Chulak. So we were sent in there to try to attack this stronghold. I hadn't had experience with tanks before that, and that's when I got acquainted with tanks, was on Operation Allenbrook.
All right. So we're all here to discuss a shared experience in Vietnam, Operation Allenbrook, as you're referring to it. Who'd like to kind of give a little background about how this started going?
Yeah, let me do that. At the time, I was stationed along with 4 tanks at Liberty Bridge, guarding the bridge. And at that time, when Doug's unit got involved and they needed tank support, I took my 4 tanks together with Bravo 2nd Platoon. Sergeant Ambisi was acting as the platoon leader there. We combined those 7 tanks, and I was a lieutenant, so I was the commander, and Sergeant Ambisi was my platoon sergeant. And we met, I think, around Fulok 6 somewhere, and then began to proceed to meet up where the infantry were, and commenced to add support. I would like to add that all 7 tanks acted superbly. The leadership, virtually by all well, I was the only officer, but all the men and all the tank commanders did an excellent job. Sergeant Ambisi is well known throughout the Corps and the tank report for his expertise and knowledge in that area, and he was we melded together and commenced the support that we needed, and pretty much all hell broke loose. And I'll let Bob talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Bob.
Well, we got involved May 5th of 68. When we got the word that we were going to be going, our tanks, this was from 2nd Platoon's tanks, that we were going to be going out joining other tanks on this operation. But there was no name for the operation. And there had already been, 1st tanks were out there with 1 or 2 tanks, and 1 tank commander had been killed by a sniper. And Sergeant Ambisi was asking anybody he was going to go on a scouting mission with a helicopter to see what we're getting into. And nobody volunteered. He said, "You want to go?" I said, "Let's go." And so I got to see from the 1,000-foot level of the mess that we were going to step into. And the area is known as Goinoi Island, as the lieutenant mentioned, but don't go on a map and look in the waterways. It was a reference to an area that when it flooded, it was surrounded by water during the rainy season. And it was difficult to get in and out. Don't get me wrong there, but it wasn't out in the ocean as you would think a typical island, but it was an island.
And Doug, tell me about how Echo Company ended up involved.
By the time this rolled around, I'd been a company commander for 5-6 months, and I was a captain at that point. And we were briefed the night before before Allenbrook or the no-name operation started. We were briefed by our infantry officers and leaders that we were going into an area of which we had no previous experience, had no reconnaissance information. We didn't have the ability to fly over in a helicopter. We were just told, you're going to cross the river at 2:00 in the morning, wade the river, and then begin this operation. So, needless to say, we were pretty apprehensive. And when we got to the other side the next morning, which was May 4th, we met up. I think we had 3 tanks that morning. I don't know which unit it was. And when we started, and our orders were kill everything out there because they knew it was a highly concentrated VC and North Vietnamese area, resupply area, all kinds of things. So we started through the underbrush, and it wasn't just a short matter of time. First thing we ran into were a bunch of women and kids. And obviously, they put them out there to slow us down, and which is always the modus operandi. And so when that happened, we stopped, and I told the tank commanders I was dealing with and my men, I said, don't fire on them. And I called back and I said, we just ran into it. I would guess there were 15 or 20 women and children. And I said, we're not opening up on them. What do you want us to do? And dead silence. And they come back and they said, well, take them with you. An underbrush, and we were running into, machine gun nests every once in a while here and there, and the tanks were taking them out for us. The only thing we could do is put them on the tanks. So we put them on the tanks. And it's these gentlemen to tell you, that steel plate over those motors in that kind of an environment is red hot. And here these little kids are, their little butts burning, and then we would run into more and more of them. And pretty soon, there were so many riding on the tanks, they couldn't turn the turns. Well, it was a recipe for disaster. And I called back and I said, we can't do this. We're risking the tanks. We're risking our, my men. We got to do something with these people. And dead silence. And finally they came back and said, turn them loose. So we turned them all loose. Interestingly enough, there was an article written a long time ago that I read about 2 years ago that they ended up evacuating like 220 civilians out of that area that day that we were ordered to shoot and kill. And so I don't know if you guys know it or not, but that's part of what the lives you saved with those tanks that day were all those civilians. So we moved on, and from what Bob just said, apparently some of those tanks then rejoined us, or maybe it's you, Don. And as I recall, we had 5 tanks with us then on November 5th. And our orders were to move westward with the river on our left flank. And then Golf Company of 27 was also there to start this operation. Well, the records indicate that there were a couple thousand North Vietnamese and Viet Cong on that island, and we were out there with 2 rifle companies, which at the most were probably 300 men. Well, you can imagine what the odds were But what we had on our side were the tanks. And if it hadn't been for them, God only knows what would have happened to us. But as we moved through, and they supported us in excellent fashion, and took care of, and we got clear over to the old railroad line that runs from Hanoi to Saigon. And it was there that we were told to cross that railroad. And of course, it was on a built-up rail bed, and to go on the other side.
It was like 20 feet. It was like 20 feet high at least.
And they couldn't get over the top of them. And so while we were sitting there waiting for somebody somewhere to make up their mind what to do, that's when they came over the top of the rail, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. They had us pinned down out in the open. And again, if it hadn't been for the tanks and for aircraft support, we'd have been had. And so we thanked our God again for that day. But so what the tanks had to do is go down and go under a bridge, a railroad bridge, to get on the other side. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that that's the only place to go through with those tanks. And so we went over there, spent a day over there trying to follow orders. And then they told us to go back. Well, those tanks were going to have to go back under the same bridge they went under.
To add to your story at that moment, it was so wet on that side, we could not go more than 100 yards past that railroad berm. And we got a tank and an Amtrak that got stuck on that side. And we had to ask for a helicopter to go out to the harbor because from the ship that we had just landed on still had the cables for the tanks. And we were able to cable up and pull these vehicles out. But from what I read in the Marine Corps reports, is the Marine officer wanted to continue west, but he said, "I'm not going without my tanks."
That was me.
Oh, okay. So he lives.
But when they told us to turn around and go back to the west, where we had come from, and these tanks had to go back under that bridge the next day, I said, we need a mine detector out here to make sure that these guys don't hit a mine. Oh, no, we don't have any. So we're out there trying to do what we'd been taught in basic school with our K-bars, poking around in the ground to see if we could find any mines, which unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we didn't find them. So first tank goes through, and thank God got through. Remember? Because then the second tank hit a mine and blew the track off. Fortunately, it didn't injure the guys inside the tank. So then it was blocked. So that the cables, you had the helicopters come. That first tank that went through backed up and hooked onto the tank that was blown and pulled it on through. Second tank pulls up there, hits another mine. So now we've got two dead tanks, and they had the tank on the other side had to back in there and hook on them, pull them through. Well, we got then they apparently took care of all the mines because we got the other two through there. And so we have 5 tanks on May 12th, Mother's Day, 1968. And we're headed across there on pulling 2 dead tanks, which totally neutralized 2 of the good tanks and 1 that was active. And about 10 o'clock in the morning, a spotter plane called me up, and he said, we call him a FAC, a forward air controller, and he said, do you have any people in that tree line to your left? And I said, yeah,
yep.
I do. And he said, well, I'd seen more gooks in the open on the other side of those trees than I've seen since I've been in Vietnam.
That was the first time I had ever seen gooks showing themselves.
Yeah.
And they were running behind that tree line, and you could just see them.
So just about the time that he and I had that conversation, they opened up on us. And I don't know how it looks from you guys' perspective, but they were throwing everything at these tanks but the kitchen sink, trying to take them out. And of course, they were tied up to tanks that they couldn't use. Then guys in those tank crews got out, got those cables unhooked. So we had 3 active tanks at that point. And
Lieutenant Scott was one of those, and I was in one of the other tanks.
and so when my lieutenant that had that platoon over there, he called me on the radio and he said, "Skipper, we're about to get overrun. You need to get over here." Well, I was caught out in the middle of the rice paddies with my radio operator. And so somehow, to this day, I don't know how, it had to be from the tank support and good Lord looking after us. He and I, my radio operator, made it over there to the left flank. And they were all over us. And so we talked a little bit on the phone. I think it may have been with John Ware. And the tanks then came to our defense. And somehow I had communication with one of the tanks. And they were restraining some of the 90 millimeter fire because of our Marines being out there. But we had to make the decision. It was either use the 90 millimeters or we were going to lose the troops and possibly the tanks. So in my book, I referred to it as a steel shield they put up that day. And they were blowing gooks away like you couldn't believe. And somehow we were able to get our dead and wounded back out of there. And all the time they were maneuvering and suppressing fire against the enemy. In one case, somebody backed into a bomb crater, and one of the tanks.
You're sitting next to him.
was that you?
Yes, yes, I'll tell you about that.
We saw the aerials, but missed the tank.
So one of the tanks backed up in front of them because they were tipped up, and the bottom of the tank was wide open for B-40.
Let me tell all that part of the story.
All right, you go ahead.
Because that's the part I'm going to...
You were a little closer.
I remember, yeah, I was. So you've confirmed, because my memory's vague on where all this happened, but you set the stage for it. So my recollection is that there was heavy fire coming everywhere, and various things took place that day that I do remember very distinctly. I had one tank to my left who was, I believe, the tank commander was a replacement that they had just brought in the evening before. And Bob, you may be able to correct me or not, but I'm going with the Johnny Cash situation. So we were a lot of RPGs, everybody shooting everything they could get to and all that kind of stuff. And the tank to my left took an RPG right through the front slope plate, and Johnny Cash, the driver, was killed. That's the only casualty or death of any Marine tanker I had during my entire tour. There's lots more otherwise. So at any rate, about that time, we started pulling back a little bit. And of course, the driver was facing the tree line, and all the guns were going that way and whatever. So this dumbass up in the cupola is responsible for pretty much providing the driver where to go. Well, I was sort of busy with the 50, and so all of a sudden, kaboom! And what the hell? I'm looking at the sky. I had allowed us to back into an arc light strike hole, and as Bob just mentioned,
huge hole.
You could see the aerial, but you couldn't see the tank. And as Doug wrote in his book, that belly's sitting right there, exposed, and there's not a lot of armor there. So I'll move along now to what I remember happened. We had a sergeant in I believe it was in you guys' platoon. Sergeant Siva was still in your platoon. He was back and forth and whatever. He was a guy he was an Indian. He was up and down in the ranks for many, many times. But he was terror in a battle. I mean, he really
was a tanker legend. He was a legend, like, out of Vietnam, and he was getting into trouble and all that. But everyone in the world, in the Marine tank world, knew who Sergeant Siva was, myself included.
Yeah, well,
He was quite unique.
And that's SEBA?
SIVA.
Yeah.
J.T. Siva. So anyhow, Sergeant Siva maneuvered his tank in front of me, got out, got some cables hooked up, and they pulled me out. I couldn't do it because it's such a steep angle, and the tank just wouldn't go. But between the two of us, got the tank out. At that point, and then after that, he got out of his tank there, and somehow or another maneuvered into the tank that was now immobile because of Johnny Cash's situation. And so he got in there, and apparently the tank commander had traversed the turret and had everything screwed up, so it was hard to get into the driver's seat. But somehow or another, Steve got in there and he got the tank moving and then pulled back. Somebody wrote that he turned around. I don't really remember, but he extracted that tank then, and we kept moving.
Well, let me add on, Siva.
Yeah, go ahead.
From a grunt watching Siva, he got that cable off that tank, and I thought it was a cable that took two people to handle. And you guys would know. He got that off of there, hooked that cable up, pulled you out, got back out, unhooked that cable, and threw it back on the tank, and amidst the most amazing amount of rocket fire and mortars and small arms fire. And I put him in for a Navy Cross for his actions that day. I didn't know who he was, and it was all done by, we didn't have much technology, obviously, but I called in and said, I don't know who this guy was, but need to figure out who he was and all that sort of thing. And then I never didn't know what happened.
He got a Silver Star.
But he ended up, they downgraded to a Silver Star. I guess.
He also ran to the other damaged tank and dragged the driver who was killed. I mean, in the amount of fire that we were taking incoming, I can't believe he got through all of that.
Exactly.
Through two different adventures, getting the tank out of the hole and then backing one up that was...
Now, so they're not overestimating what part they served. In 4 hours, I lost 52 men, killed and wounded. And if it hadn't been for them, I think the whole company could have been taken out, because what we had to do was to try to get everybody pulled back as they gave the shield. I mean, this took a lot of time. It wasn't like a 5-minute deal. And we got into a half moon position back against a river. It's the only way that we could even come close to surviving. And it was so bad that the helicopters, the river was washed down deep in that area. The helicopters would dive down below the riverbank about a half a mile away and fly up the river and then come up over the bank and slam it down, throw out ammunition, take casualties, and back down and get out of there. And all the time, these guys were coordinating with us. When the chopper would come, they would open up an additional fire on the tree line to try to protect those choppers. I mean, it was the greatest cooperative effort amongst people who had never seen each other, and I knew absolutely nothing about tanks other than I thought they were a steel coffin, except when it rained. And then I knew why they were in there sleeping in the dry. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
Go ahead, you're doing great.
And then we gradually, I'll back up. When I was up there close to the tree line, whoever I was talking to, there was a machine gun just tearing us to pieces. And whoever I was talking to, I said, you need to fire a 90 or I don't know if I called it a 90, but you need to fire the big gun into that machine gun over there. And whoever it was said, well, if we do, you're liable to take some casualties. And I said I'm the closest one to the tank. Just do it. We got to do it. And I would have to tell you that after that blast, which those things will destroy your vision even, for a few seconds. But I went to, my mind pretty much went numb for several hours, and I can't remember what all we did, but till I was finally back by the river, and we had a lot of heat casualties that day trying to pull back.
A lot.
I had a Sergeant Johan. He personally saved 9 Marines. He carried them back to get them back for evacuation. But and by the way, he's got COVID today. He lives up in Montana, and he's really suffering. He made it all these years, and now he's got COVID.
The temperature index that day was 125.
Is that right?
In fact, a couple of the days of the operation, it was recorded. I learned how they record these things. It was a beautiful balmy 80 degrees in Da Nang. And I said, I know that's not true. But when you got inland, that's when the heat really started.
See, the other thing these guys lived through, they were putting mortar fire out like it was raining. And those mortar rounds, if they'd hit on top of the tank, it'd be like an airburst for the grunts like us. And I can't tell you what an important role they played that day and every other day we were around tanks. They were just amazing.
Were you out because Allenbrook lasted so long, were you out on the field when we were brought under friendly artillery fire? It was at dusk.
Yeah, I'll get you. Want to?
It was on that side of the berm that it happened.
Yeah, you want to hear what happened that day? There was a sniper, some old rice farmer, on the other side of the river, and in the evenings he would sit over there and plunk at us.
Yeah.
So I told the artillery observer, I said, give us the night defensive fires, which are the ones you call in on yourself when you're being overrun. And I said, put those in, but then also put a concentration over on the other side of the river, because I said, if that guy is over there, that's where he'll be that night. So that night, before dusk, sure enough, he starts plinking at us. So I said, get that son again. Well, either he called in the wrong number or the artillery got the wrong number, and they fired our final defensive fires instead of, we took 22 rounds of 8-inch.
My tank commander or platoon sergeant was off the tank attending a meeting, probably with you guys, and he got caught in the middle of that, coming back to the tank, which would be the first time he was ever had to be act like a grunt under open artillery fire, and he was as wide-eyed. And when he got back to that tank, he said, "I don't ever want to do that again." He said, "You talk about feeling helpless under an artillery attack." He said it was just
and the way
unbelievable.
The way the artillery was organized in those areas, instead of every grunt unit like mine having an artillery unit firing for us, they were overlapped between the Army and the Marine Corps. So when that firing started, nobody knew for sure who was firing it. They couldn't get it stopped.
Everybody was screaming to stop. Yeah.
But 22 rounds of 8-inch, and boy, the only thing that saved us, we were down along the river and we just dug in that sand. So everybody dove in the holes and the rounds were going into the sand. They weren't causing much damage. But then the other thing that these guys were involved in with us, and Bob and I were talking, I'm not sure exactly where in the sequence of all this, but we were in a night position, and we had open rice paddies in front of us, and we had parked the tanks in what we call defilade. In other words, they were in this old canal, and just the 90 millimeters would just give murderous fire at ground level. And we were told as grunts, as company commanders, don't put out listening posts unless you're sure where they are, because every company had what you call a company TOR that night that you were responsible for. So, okay, and so this was This was after 7 months or so of being a company commander. There was no way I would put my troops out there in listening posts. Well, this brand new company commander beside me, he puts out listening posts. And so, make sure they don't get in front of the other company. Yeah, right. Well, there was a tree line that kind of came down towards my company in the area where I was. And so I'm going to let you tell what you saw.
I was getting about dusk, and we were setting in position after the day like we just described. And we were setting up. I was the gunner on the tank. I was up on the turret along with my tank commander. And one of the grunts in back of the tank called to us and said, you want to see if you can see anything in front of you? The grass was so high they couldn't see in front of them.
That was one of my men.
So they passed up something we had only heard about called a starlight scope. It was the first night vision device. And it was, everybody wanted their hands on it to see what it was like. And it just happened to be a course of timing that I spotted 7 guys snooping and pooping across the front of us. My tank commander also confirmed it.
So then
they got back to you.
The tank commander, of course, called me because he was sitting in my area and told me what they had. So I called the company beside me and I said, "Are you sure you don't have any listening posts out there in front of us?" "Oh, no, ours are over in front of us." Well, I knew it wasn't ours that I didn't put any out there. So I told the tank commander to commence firing. And they did. And near as we could tell, the first blast killed the radio operator and destroyed the radio. And the next thing we knew was a red flare got popped, which is a signal, only signaling we had, there was a problem. So they immediately stopped firing. But I think, what would we have, 7 killed? 4 killed.
That's been a question that it's been, all of us have had different numbers, but I'm pretty sure what I saw, because they brought the bodies in right past our tank. They were carrying them on ponchos, and there were 5 killed, and 2, I think, were severely wounded. And that was, I'm still living with that night.
And I didn't want to make sure that everyone who sees this understands it was not their fault. I'm the one that made that decision, and I've lived with it ever since. I made the decision based upon all the information I had. When I went on R&R later in May, I went to Tripler Army Hospital and tried to find those 2 guys. And it was 2. I only saw 2 there, so I'm sure your figures are right. And they were horribly mangled, but they were still alive. And that's about all I could do is apologize to them. And those are the things that cause some of us to have mental issues, especially when it's your own people that I wish I could have made a different decision, but my heart goes out to the families that were involved. But these tankers were doing exactly what they were there to do and what I asked them to do.
That night, it happened I don't think it was before midnight. And the rest of that night, voices would be yelled at in our direction from the grunts along our perimeter. They didn't know the details. They just knew the tanks just killed 5 of their people. And nobody's real happy about that one. And they started threatening us through the night. Say, wait till the next firefight. You're dead. Don't stick your head out in the next time we have a shooting. And that, we were scared to no end that whole night after that.
Well, and I want to apologize for that because that was my men apparently were doing it. I didn't know that was going on.
I don't blame them today. I'd have been as mad as hell as they were.
Well, but...
So I'd like to share about that issue, a situation in that in heated combat, you don't always know what's going on. And we were displaced, my tank and a group of tanks were displaced along the line away from where you guys were.
Mm-hmm.
When all this happened, I didn't really know anything about it until the next morning. And it was not like nobody was wanting to report it or whatever, but things were going on. And so I read about this in your book and your book. And so it's just an interesting point because it was really chaos.
Well, I know we're getting short on time, but I just want to tell you, these guys are my heroes. They really are. And I can't thank them enough for their service. We were all there together. Everybody was trying to do the best we could. And unfortunately, in a combat situation, that doesn't always end out the way you would hope. But
I'll give this as a reciprocal. Tanks got parceled out wherever they thought something was going to happen, or somebody wanted tanks, and you go be working with a different unit from one day to the next sometime. There wasn't a lot of good tank infantry cooperation. Nobody had been trained for it. And without a doubt, if someone had asked me, the 7th Marines were the best tank unit of how to use us and cooperate with us of all the units I worked with, including 9th Marines, 6th Marines.
Yeah,
they were good, very good.
Well, looking back over my life, the only thing that I can tell you that prepared me for that was just growing up out in the country where everybody had to cooperate to survive. That's the way it is in Wyoming. If you don't stick with your neighbors, nobody gets through the blizzard like the 49 blizzard. All that history you've heard about. I want to thank you for your service, both of you, and be sure and tell your men that.
Well, right back at you. There are, I know, as Doug said, we're probably running out of time, but there's.
Yeah, you got the last word here.
Sorry?
You got the last word here.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go on record that Sergeant Siva finally got his Silver Star, which I put him in for, and he was already put in by other folks for a higher decoration. But he finally got it, but it was only a few years ago. So these things take forever sometimes. But there is one anecdote that I think we would be remiss if we didn't put it into this story. And that is that one night we were setting in the tanks. At nightfall, we'd oftentimes go in and put Staff Sergeant Mbezi and myself, we would physically get on the ground and set the tanks in exactly where we wanted them. And we were doing that one night. I don't remember which night it was, but all of a sudden all hell broke loose. And RPGs were coming out of the hedgerow or wherever at us. They were not only shooting at the tanks, they were shooting at myself and Mbezi. And you can see those things coming right at you. So we commenced DD, and we ran. The closest place that we could get from where we were at the point at that time was close to his tank. And we would put, I don't know how we did it, but somehow or another we crawled under the tank. But in the meantime, Mbezi took an RPG somehow or another.
Yes, I can tell you.
So go ahead and finish that last little part.
At the moment that the lieutenant's talking about, myself and Jerry Hearn are sitting on top of the turret. It's dusk is setting in, and an RPG comes out of nowhere right for us and goes between the two of us, high up on the tank, and we immediately dropped down and started firing and everything. We didn't see where the RPG at all went. It went right in between Mbezi's legs, detonated. And it was a miracle of God that he was not hit by any fragments. It was just because it was a heat type round, there's not many fragments necessarily. And he was lucky in that aspect. He could not get on the tank. We had to build a ramp, and he would not leave the field either the next day. He couldn't walk. We had to build him in a wooden seat in the tank commander's position. If he came under fire, he couldn't even get his head down because he's sitting on this thing we made. And he spent the rest of the operation that way, with his head well above, leading him. But that was the man.
I would close with an old saying, the grunts, you never see the one that hits you.
That's true.
Great way to wrap that up. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to share the stories with me today. It's really an honor and a pleasure, but most importantly, thank you so much for your service. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.